Tahoe's water level has dropped to a 4-year low. It was hovering around the natural rim, but this week it fell just below it.
It was exactly 6:42 in the morning when the submersible slipped beneath the perfectly calm surface of Lake Tahoe. For the first 11 seconds, the people gathered around the glowing monitor on the research vessel barely felt as though they were watching something underwater at all. The lake was so astonishingly clear that it resembled a sheet of polished glass rather than water. The aluminum frame of the vehicle reflected beneath itself, its cables drifted like dark ribbons through the crystal-clear depths, and long columns of golden sunlight stretched downward as though they would continue forever. Lake Tahoe had always been famous for this remarkable clarity. On calm mornings, people standing on a boat could drop a coin overboard and watch it flash and spin through the water for what felt like an eternity before finally disappearing into the blue. If you're fascinated by real mysteries, hidden history, and incredible scientific discoveries like this one, take a second to subscribe to the channel. Yet everyone aboard the research vessel understood that this descent was unlike any ordinary dive. The machine was heading far beyond the reach of any human diver, toward a place that had inspired more than a century of rumors, mysteries, and impossible stories. Some believed there was no lake bed at all. Others believed the bottom existed but was crowded with the silent dead. For generations, Lake Tahoe had carried two legends heavier than its immense body of water. The first claimed the lake had no bottom. According to old stories, somewhere near its center, the earth simply vanished into an endless shaft connected to hidden rivers, distant lakes, or perhaps even the ocean itself. Anything that disappeared into those depths, people said, was gone forever. The second legend was even darker. Because the deepest water remained so cold throughout the year, countless stories insisted that bodies never truly decomposed there. According to whispered tales from the casino era, victims of organized crime rested deep below the surface exactly as they had entered the lake, dressed in suits, hair neatly combed, faces untouched by time, standing upright in the darkness like silent statues, waiting to be discovered. The most famous version of the story centered on legendary French explorer Jacques Cousteau. As the tale was repeated around campfires, marinas, and across countless internet discussions, Cousteau supposedly descended into Lake Tahoe's deepest waters, returned pale and visibly shaken, and refused to explain what he had witnessed. His only reported words became one of the lake's greatest mysteries. The world isn't ready for what's down there. Whether true or not, that single sentence transformed Lake Tahoe into something far more frightening than an ordinary lake. For over 100 years, nobody could prove any of these stories. The lake guarded its secrets with absolute silence, freezing temperatures, and depths no human could easily reach. Everything changed when technology finally caught up with the mystery. For the first time, remotely operated vehicles and sophisticated survey equipment were sent all the way to the bottom, while cameras recorded every moment of the journey. What those machines revealed changed people's understanding of Lake Tahoe forever, but not in the way anyone expected. Before understanding the discoveries, however, it helps to understand the lake itself. High in the Sierra Nevada mountains, straddling the border between California and Nevada, Lake Tahoe rests inside a massive basin carved by ancient geological faults and sculpted over thousands of years by glaciers. From the shoreline it appears calm and inviting, surrounded by towering pines, granite cliffs, sandy beaches, and snow-covered mountains. Yet that peaceful surface hides an extraordinary world beneath it. Tahoe is one of the deepest lakes in North America. At its deepest measured point, the bottom lies approximately 1,645 feet below the surface. The number is almost impossible to imagine until it is compared with familiar landmarks. The Empire State Building, standing roughly 1,454 feet from street level to its antenna, could be lowered completely into the lake and still remain nearly 200 feet underwater. Even the Eiffel Tower, rising about 1,000 feet, would disappear long before reaching the bottom. Altogether, Lake Tahoe holds nearly 39 trillion gallons of fresh water, enough to cover the entire state of California in more than a foot of water. It is far more than an ordinary mountain lake. It behaves more like a vast inland sea, complete with its own weather, hidden currents, and crushing pressure deep below the surface. As the survey vehicle continued its slow descent, the monitors inside the control room began revealing why Lake Tahoe had inspired so many frightening legends. The brilliant golden sunlight gradually faded as the water changed from bright sapphire to darker shades of blue. Meanwhile, the temperature displayed on the side of the monitor, which had started comfortably in the 60-degree range near the warm summer surface, steadily dropped before eventually reaching a point where it simply stopped changing. This phenomenon is entirely real and forms the scientific foundation behind many of the lake's legends. Near the surface, Tahoe behaves like any other freshwater lake, warming during the summer months and cooling through the winter. However, approximately 300 feet below the surface lies a remarkable boundary where the seasons effectively disappear. Beneath that level, the water remains at a nearly constant temperature of just above 39 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the entire year. At that exact temperature, fresh water reaches its greatest density, causing it to sink naturally and remain trapped in the deepest parts of the lake. No matter how hot the summer becomes or how cold winter grows, the deep water never changes. It remains locked in permanent darkness, permanent stillness, and near-freezing cold, creating one of the most mysterious underwater environments in North America. Beneath that invisible boundary, the lake entered a world that almost seemed disconnected from time itself. The water settled into a temperature just above 39 degrees Fahrenheit, the precise point at which fresh water becomes its heaviest. Once it reached that temperature, it simply sank and remained there, creating a vast layer of water that never seemed to change. Summer sunshine could blaze across the mountains, and winter storms could bury the shoreline beneath snow, yet none of it mattered in the darkness below. The deep water never warmed in July, never froze in January, and never responded to the changing seasons. It existed in a state of permanent stillness, locked in motionless cold and absolute darkness. As the survey vehicle continued downward, another invisible boundary quietly disappeared behind it. At roughly 700 feet, sunlight surrendered completely. There was no gradual twilight waiting below, no faint glow filtering through the water. The light simply ceased to exist. From that point onward, the cameras could see nothing until powerful floodlights pierced the darkness. Even then, the brilliant beams carved only a narrow tunnel through an endless black void stretching in every direction. Beyond those circles of artificial light, there was only emptiness. Standing in the control room, the researchers finally understood why so many frightening stories had survived for generations. The science itself made the legend sound believable. In ordinary lakes, where the water is warm, rich in oxygen, and filled with active bacteria, nature works quickly. Wood begins to rot, metal slowly corrodes, and even a human body breaks down in a surprisingly short time. But Lake Tahoe's deepest water followed different rules. Near freezing temperatures, still water, and extremely low oxygen levels slowed nearly every biological process. The bacteria responsible for decomposition could barely function. Nothing stopped decaying entirely, but everything happened so slowly that it challenged common sense. Suddenly, it became easier to understand how people began believing that anything sinking into Tahoe's deepest water might remain almost unchanged for decades, perhaps even centuries. A forgotten shoe, a sunken boat, or even a human body seemed capable of resting silently on the lake bed, looking eerily similar to the day it disappeared beneath the surface. It was a disturbing possibility, but one rooted in just enough scientific truth to make it difficult to dismiss. Storytellers recognized that immediately. They took the lake's genuine depth, its permanent cold, and its remarkable ability to preserve objects, then carefully layered imagination on top of reality. Before long, the stories grew darker with every retelling. People spoke of corpses standing upright beneath the water, perfectly preserved suits worn by long-forgotten victims, and mysterious divers who returned too terrified to explain what they had witnessed. Since no one could safely reach those depths, there was no evidence to challenge the tales. The lake became a place ruled by imagination instead of observation, and over time, those stories hardened into beliefs that many people accepted as unquestionable truth. Among all those legends, one story rose above the rest because it carried the name of perhaps the world's most respected explorer of the oceans. According to the tale, sometime during the 1970s, when his fame had reached its peak, the legendary French explorer and filmmaker Jacques Cousteau brought a submersible to Lake Tahoe. The story claimed he descended alone, or nearly alone, into the freezing darkness, passing beyond the depths where ordinary divers could survive, until he reached the mysterious floor no human had ever truly explored. When he finally surfaced, witnesses supposedly noticed something had changed. The fearless explorer who had spent a lifetime investigating the world's oceans appeared pale, strangely quiet, and deeply unsettled, as though the darkness had shown him something even he could not comprehend. Then came the sentence that would become inseparable from Lake Tahoe itself. When someone reportedly asked Cousteau what he had seen, the legend claimed he answered with only a few unforgettable words. "The world isn't ready for what's down there." It was a perfect mystery because it explained nothing while suggesting everything. The sentence never mentioned bodies, monsters, or hidden civilizations, yet anyone hearing it immediately filled the silence with their own fears. The lake was transformed from an unusually deep mountain basin into a forbidden place guarding unimaginable secrets. If a man like Jacques Cousteau, who had explored countless dangerous waters across the planet without hesitation, supposedly refused to reveal what he had witnessed, then people naturally assumed the truth had to be more terrifying than anything they could imagine. That single sentence became the foundation supporting nearly every frightening story that followed. Tales of perfectly preserved corpses standing upright, mob victims resting forever in expensive suits, and every other unsettling rumor seemed to draw their strength from those few mysterious words. Whether people realized it or not, the entire mythology of Lake Tahoe had come to rest upon a single unforgettable quote. As the survey continued, the story itself reached a moment where it had to slow down and confront an uncomfortable truth. Everything that came next depended on accepting one simple fact. The most famous quote ever associated with Lake Tahoe had no verifiable source. For decades, people had repeated the story as though it were history. They claimed that Jacques Cousteau had descended into the deepest part of the lake, surfaced pale and shaken, and quietly warned that the world isn't ready for what's down there. It was one of those stories that sounded so perfect, It almost demanded to be true. Yet the closer anyone looked, the more the evidence seemed to disappear. There was no recording, no interview, no newspaper article, no documentary, no dated transcript. Every version of the tale pointed back to another retelling, but none pointed to the moment Cousteau had supposedly spoken those unforgettable words. Even more surprising, there was no confirmed record showing that Jacques Cousteau had ever explored the deepest part of Lake Tahoe at all. Members of his own family spent years quietly correcting the rumor, explaining that the famous story simply was not true. Yet the legend refused to disappear. Like so many great myths, it no longer depended on proof. It survived because people continued repeating it, each generation passing it to the next until the story became stronger than the evidence. That realization changed everything. The sentence that had become the foundation of Tahoe's darkest reputation might never have been spoken by the man it was forever attached to. Once that cornerstone was removed, every other terrifying story resting upon it suddenly demanded a second look. None of it meant the lake was shallow. It certainly was not. Nor did it mean the freezing water failed to preserve objects remarkably well. The science remained completely real. What disappeared was the assumption that those scientific facts somehow proved an army of perfectly preserved bodies waited silently beneath the surface. That leap had never been built on evidence. It had been built on imagination. And once that became clear, curiosity naturally replaced fear. Instead of wondering what storytellers imagined, people wanted to know what was actually there. They wanted to see the bottom with their own eyes. For most of Lake Tahoe's history, that had been impossible. Ironically, the very conditions that gave birth to the legends also prevented anyone from disproving them. Deep diving is dangerous anywhere on Earth, but Lake Tahoe combines several deadly challenges into one place. The lake's deepest basin lies well beyond 1,000 feet below the surface, far beyond the limits of recreational scuba diving. Most divers are warned never to venture much deeper than about 130 feet because nitrogen begins affecting the brain like a powerful anesthetic. Beyond that, the crushing pressure increases rapidly, turning the gases inside the human body into serious hazards. Every additional foot underwater demands greater precision, longer decompression times, and carries increasingly severe consequences for even the smallest mistake. Depth alone would make Tahoe intimidating, but it is only part of the danger. Beneath the upper layers, the near-freezing water strips heat from the human body with astonishing speed. Even wearing a fully sealed dry suit, survival becomes a race against time. Then comes the final challenge, one many people never consider. Lake Tahoe sits more than 6,000 feet above sea level. Because the surrounding air is already thinner, the pressure calculations every diver depends upon become significantly more complicated. A dive that would be considered manageable along the coast suddenly becomes far more dangerous high in the Sierra Nevada. Depth, freezing temperatures, and high altitude combine into a place almost perfectly designed to keep people away from its deepest secrets. For generations, that combination protected the myths. The lake bed remained hidden beyond human reach, allowing anyone to believe whatever story they preferred because there was no practical way to prove otherwise. Eventually, however, technology solved the problem that human endurance never could. If people could not survive the journey themselves, they could send machines instead. The first tool was sonar. Powerful pulses of sound traveled downward into the darkness, struck the unseen lake floor, and returned as echoes. Each echo measured only a single point, but millions of those measurements could be combined into an extraordinarily detailed map, revealing the hidden shape of the basin with remarkable precision. Alongside the sonar came remotely operated vehicles. Suspended beneath the research vessel by long cables, these robotic explorers carried bright lights, high-definition cameras, and sophisticated scientific instruments into places no diver could safely reach. Every image, every measurement, and every discovery traveled instantly back through the tether to the surface, where researchers sat safely inside the control room, watching the bottom of Lake Tahoe appear before them for the very first time. For the first time in history, the lake's greatest mystery was no longer being explored through rumors or imagination. It was being explored through evidence. The real breakthrough of the Lake Tahoe expedition was not dramatic in the way people had imagined for generations. There was no fearless diver descending alone into impossible darkness, and there was no explorer returning to the surface too frightened to describe what he had seen. Instead, the revolution happened quietly. It unfolded through patience, precision, and careful science. The research team guided their instruments across the basin methodically, moving back and forth in perfectly planned grid patterns, much like a farmer carefully plowing a field. Their goal was never to chase monsters or search for long-lost corpses. They were mapping the lake exactly as scientists map any unknown landscape, measuring every slope, every ridge, every layer of sediment, and every contour hidden beneath thousands of feet of water. Yet, without realizing it, every accurate sonar return carried them one step closer to dismantling the oldest legend Lake Tahoe had ever known. Every clean echo bouncing back from the lake floor quietly proved something people had argued about for more than a century. There was, in fact, a bottom. When the remotely operated vehicle finally slipped beneath Tahoe's famously transparent surface, the monitors inside the control room immediately filled with an image so clear it almost seemed unreal. The water glowed with an impossibly pure shade of blue, so brilliant that it appeared almost artificial. It was exactly the breathtaking clarity that had made Lake Tahoe famous around the world. During the first 10, 20, and even 30 feet of the descent, the researchers could hardly believe what they were seeing. The water looked less like water and more like perfectly polished glass. The shadow of the ROV drifted across enormous granite boulders, while every pebble scattered across the sandy bottom remained perfectly visible. Sunlight rippled over the pale granite floor in delicate waves, creating patterns that resembled a shimmering net spread across the bottom of an enormous swimming pool. One researcher quietly joked that a newspaper could probably be read from that depth, and for those first few moments the comment hardly seemed like an exaggeration. But the lake slowly began revealing its true nature. Clarity and depth, the researchers realized, were two very different things. As the vehicle continued descending, its electric thrusters hummed steadily through the tether, while the view on the monitors transformed almost imperceptibly. At first, the change seemed beautiful. The brilliant blue gradually deepened into darker shades. Then it became unsettling. Colors disappeared one after another, exactly as physics predicts, beneath the water's surface. Reds faded first, followed by oranges, leaving the underwater world painted almost entirely in muted greens and blues. Soon, even those colors surrendered to the growing darkness. In the corner of every monitor, the digital depth display climbed with quiet determination, 100 feet, then 200, while the brilliant ceiling of sunlight retreated farther overhead, shrinking into nothing more than a faint glow that seemed impossibly distant. By the time the vehicle crossed roughly 300 feet, the sun had surrendered completely. The ROV's powerful floodlights became the only source of illumination. Their bright beams carved a narrow cone through water that had turned into the deep blue-black color of approaching night. Outside those artificial lights, there was nothing to focus on at all. It was not merely darkness. It was the complete absence of visible reality. This was the mysterious zone where Lake Tahoe's legendary refrigerator effect truly began. Here, the water remained permanently cold, permanently still, and permanently isolated from the changing seasons above. The crushing pressure alone reduced the chances of human survival to almost nothing, explaining why generations of people had been forced to rely on imagination instead of observation. Then, without warning, something appeared that no one in the control room expected. At first it emerged only as unusual shapes within the sonar returns. Moments later, the floodlights swept across them, and silence filled the room. They were trees, not broken logs, not drifting debris, not strange rock formations, actual trees, standing upright exactly where they had once grown. Their trunks rose naturally from the lakebed, giving the astonishing illusion that the surrounding water had somehow become invisible air. Some had long since lost their branches, leaving behind smooth, weathered trunks that had stood beneath the surface for thousands of years. Others still carried pale skeletal limbs stretching upward into the darkness like silent hands reaching toward a sky they could no longer touch. The trees were arranged exactly as any living forest would be, each separated from the next by natural spacing, each rooted firmly in the place where it had first taken hold, centuries before human history recorded the existence of Lake Tahoe. And yet, this ancient woodland rested nearly 300 feet beneath the surface, hidden below waters crossed every summer by fishermen, swimmers, kayakers, and tourists who had no idea an entire drowned forest waited silently beneath them. For several long moments, nobody inside the control room spoke. Every person understood that they were looking at something profoundly unsettling, not because it was supernatural, but because it was unmistakably real. For several long moments, nobody inside the control room spoke. The silence felt completely natural, because there was something deeply unsettling about what filled the monitors. A fallen log drifting through shallow water would never surprise anyone. The mind immediately finds a simple explanation for it. But an entire tree, still rooted in the ground, standing perfectly upright exactly where it had once reached toward the mountain sky, created an entirely different feeling. It meant the landscape itself had disappeared beneath the lake without being destroyed. This was not driftwood carried by a current. It was an ancient forest still standing exactly where it had grown, as though the water had quietly risen around it and swallowed the land without disturbing a single trunk.